Greetings YouTube, my name is Murray Carter from CarterCutlery.com and welcome to the series called Carter Cutlery Japan Tour. Today we're going to visit what I consider to be the world's best bladesmith. Today's title is Carter Cutlery Best Japanese Bladesmith Visit. We're going to be featuring footage from a visit to Mr. Shiraki's shop in Sakai, Osaka, Japan. Roughly 18 years ago, while I was living in Japan and I was fervently studying Japanese bladesmithing, I had inquired as to who may be one of the finest bladesmiths in the country to learn from. I found out that there were excellent number of bladesmiths in the Sakai area in Osaka, and that it had a regional history of bladesmithing. And so I remember hopping on my motorcycle and driving up there without really a firm plan on who I was going to visit or how the trip would end up, really. It was quite a sense of adventure. And I ended up meeting a gentleman named Mr. Shiraki, and he was so kind to take me under his wing for the few days that I was there. And he showed me his bladesmithing shop and his techniques and let me watch him as he was forging blades. That was the start of a long relationship which endures to today, and I've been so blessed to learn a lot from him. I've probably spent in total 3 or 4 weeks under his direct supervision, learning from him, watching him, observing him, and having him answer all of my questions. We've become quite friendly. Roughly 10 years ago, while I was still living in Japan, the Japanese National Broadcasting Network, NHK, they propositioned me with a 1-hour-long documentary. The theme of their documentary was the Gaijin bladesmith, the foreigner bladesmith, who was trying his best to make traditional Japanese cutlery, in need of some good tutelage, gets the favored tutelage from one of the Japanese masters. That was kind of the outline for their program. And so when they propositioned me with that, I said, great, I know just who we could use for the filming and where we could film it. And so I immediately took that proposition to Mr. Shiraki, and he was more than willing to cooperate. While we filmed up in Osaka for a week with the NHK film crew, I actually stayed right in Mr. Shiraki's house, and even there's some embarrassing footage of me in the Japanese ofuro. Those NHK filmers, no shame, they just marched right into the bathroom. I was soaking in the bath, and they broadcast that on national TV. Not my finest moment, but there was nothing revealed. It was just suggested. Anyhow, we are quite friendly, and we revisited this shop, and you'll see in the footage. I was just so overjoyed to see Mr. Shiraki again. It had been, I think, 6 years since I had seen him while I was living here in the United States. And quite honestly, I was fairly emotional saying goodbye to him too. You may know that bladesmiths in that kind of environment aren't necessarily going to enjoy the longevity, perhaps, of others in more benign workplaces. The lungs and so on get polluted quite badly by the gases and the dust and so on. It's not uncommon for bladesmiths to pass on in their early 60s. So, and that's right where Mr. Shiraki is. And while he seemed pretty healthy to me when I visited him, I let my imagination run wild, and it was quite an emotional goodbye. So I am very close to him, and I'm very proud to bring you footage from his shop. Now, what you're going to see in some of the footage here is Mr. Shiraki forge welding chunks of either white steel or blue steel, both made by Hitachi, to the Gokunan Tetsu, or the mild steel. And Mr. Shiraki's specialty is forge welding 2-layer laminate blades, most commonly seen in the yanagiba, or otherwise known as sushi knives, and some of the single-edged or chisel-ground deba bocho, which are the really thick spine, heavy knives for breaking down and dressing fish. After he forge welds the carbon steel to the mild steel, in which you'll see the sparks flying out and the molten flux, He'll then forge the blade to probably within 10 or 15% of its final dimensions. He then turns the billet around, puts it back in the forge, heats up the tang area, and then he forges out the tang. As you see, he's so efficient with every hammer blow that in no time at all he's forged the rough shape of one of his knives. The knives are then put in a tray for cooling, and this acts like an annealing step because the blades are put in, all hot, surrounded by other blades, and they cool slowly enough that they are annealed. He's forge welding the steel on. That's what you saw, and then forging the tang out. Then it goes into these bins. Can you hear me okay, Seamus?
I think so.
Yeah, goes into the bins. Then from the bins it goes into these big turning machines that are like blast cabinets. And then there's all these blades here have already come out of the blast cabinet. And this young man, he's going to show us how they cold forge. Then he's going to do the shearing, where they're going to cut them to the size and shape.
What's he forge welding?
The carbon steel to mild steel.
Is he laminating it?
Yeah, laminating. That's what he's been doing.
Oh, I thought he was forging the tanks.
Well, he was doing the tanks as well, but we'll watch once. When all the sparks go out, that's when he's tack welding, and then bum, 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 bum,
And he's using a gas forge.
Gas forge.
Does that mean he has to work faster not to lose carbon?
That's right. He does one forging operation. Once the blades are forged and then annealed, you'll see Mr. Shiraki's apprentice cold forging the blades and hammering them down another 5 or 10% to their final dimensions. It's a fairly noisy job, and you'll see all throughout the hammering process they've got little pieces of cotton stuck in their ears. It's a very noisy environment, as you've noticed in this video. Once the blades are cold forged roughly to shape, the next step is to cut them out to the final dimensions, the outer dimensions. This is done in Osaka and many shops throughout Japan with the use of hydraulic presses. And it makes short work of chopping off the excess metal so that they get the exact shape they're looking for. As a side note, many bladesmiths in Japan and workers in these shops have lost fingers with these hydraulic presses. It's one reason why I choose not to use them in my shop, but it is a highly efficient way for, instead of grinding many knives to shape, you can cut them out on these presses much faster, and you can do hundreds of blades in a day. Once the blades have been cold forged and now cut to their final dimensions with the use of the hydraulic presses, the next step is to get them ready for heat treating. Yeah, because Mr. Shiraki is heat treating tomorrow, he's only going to work today until lunchtime, and he's going to call it quits and go and take a nice Japanese ofuro, the Japanese public baths, and really rest and relax and go home and get ready for the most important day of his week, which is a heat treating day. He wants to be well rested to be able to focus his efforts on that. We'll come back tomorrow at 10 o'clock in the morning and watch him perform some of the finest heat treating in all of Japan. All of Mr. Shiraki's blades, as with any high quality Japanese laminated blade, is coated in a special proprietary mixture of clay and then let dry. The thickness of the clay that's applied to the blade depends on the final desired result in the blade itself. It also depends on what the quenching medium is. A blade quenched in oil versus one quenched in water is going to require a different application of clay. Here you can see Mr. Shiraki heating the blades up in his heat treating only forge, which is fired up with pine charcoal and with a small bed of coke underneath. And he's heating the blades up and he's quenching them in water. Again, depending on the desired result of the blade or the steel of the blade, quenching in oil is another option. After the blades have been forged and quenched through the process of heat treating, the blades are then transported to the second floor of his building, where they'll be ground, they'll be straightened, ground, sharpened, and polished. Here you can see footage of storage of blades in their little cubicles, divided by steel type, blade type, and length. And due to the nature of the laminate construction, the steel in the laminate often continues to expand and move as it's continuing its thermal transformation as a result of the heat process, the heat treating process. Sometimes it can take 2 or 3 months for the blades to stabilize. If you heat treated a double layer or a laminate blade on a Tuesday and then sharpen it and ground it on a Wednesday, it wouldn't be surprising to come back on Thursday and see that the blade had warped and moved a little bit because the carbon steel was not finished its transformation. So by storing the blades in cubicles, they'll be ready for grinding in 3 or 4 months and be a lot more stable, and even after the grinding and sharpening and polishing stage, they're less likely to move and warp when they're delivered to the customer. My 4 guests and I thoroughly enjoyed our visit to Mr. Shiitake. It was probably one of the great highlights of the trip. We never got bored of just standing there watching him forge those blades. We were kind of memorized by that hot red steel being so quickly and efficiently pounded into those blades, which were going to serve, sushi chefs all across Japan for decades to come. It was just a great experience, and many of the guests in our group purchased some blades to take home with them as souvenirs, and then we had a nice, warm, and friendly goodbye, and then we were on our way. This is a specimen of what the Japanese call honyaki, which is the differential hardening of an all-steel blade. This blade isn't laminated. So what happened was they had all carbon steel blade forged and heavily cold forged, straightened and roughly ground. You can see it's got the beginnings of a secondary edge on it. And then they coat it in a very special refractory clay. Every bladesmith who does honyaki has his own recipe for the refractory clay. And it's clay and a little bit of charcoal dust and a few other things in there as well. The critical element is that it doesn't crack or break off while it's in the fire. Then it's quenched in either water or oil. This clay was quenched in oil. And it's at that point that it's allowed to flake off and break off, but not before the body of the blade hardens, leaving the back of the blade soft. And this is why you get that wavy line pattern or hamon on the blade afterwards. And then this all needs to be broken off and ground off in order to move on with the next steps.
Watching him, the blades he's doing right now, which is the square front ones, not these. He's quenching them on the right side, I think in water.
Yeah, left side was oil.
Yeah. Every once in a while, he'll take one of them and he'll put it back in on top of the coal for just a second or two, and then take it out. After the whole, first he do quenching, then most of them he bangs, listens, and somebody puts back in
all
for a second.
of these blades are going to be tempered in an air oven, but I'm sure what he's doing is when they come out of the fire, if they're warped or bent a little bit more than usual, he's heating them and then hammering them on his wooden block while they're still warm. So my 4 guests and I just had a fantastic time on our visit to Mr. Shiitake's shop, and we then further headed up to our next destination. If you've enjoyed this footage, keep in mind that we'll be offering future guided cutlery tour trips of Japan, and if anyone's interested, you can contact me directly at Murray, M-U-R-R-A-Y, at Carter Cutlery, CarterCutlery.com, and inquire as to when we're taking our next trip. This is Murray Carter from CarterCutlery.com. Thank you for watching.